Is it going?
Yeah.
Okay.
Maybe.
Question 1. In our class book, our main character describes his experiences as being rough, or just being an inmate in general. There were homemade weapons, fighting, and violence. What was it like to teach in the JDC, and how were you feeling on your first day?
Oh, yeah, okay. Can I answer the first question or the second question first?
Yeah.
My first day there, I was really pretty nervous because I grew up I'm from Wisconsin and I worked in Wisconsin. And I grew up in a small community that was, I don't know, 5,000, 6,000 people. It was a predominantly white community. And I would say I was pretty sheltered when it came to working with students who came from different backgrounds. And as you probably have learned a little bit from the book, in our society, the majority of juvenile offenders aren't white. They come from African American or Hispanic backgrounds. And Ethan Allen, the place that I worked, was very much like that. Our population was probably about 25 to 30% white. So the majority of the students that I worked with came from an entirely different cultural background. And I wasn't quite sure how I would respond to students like that because I had never worked with them. And when I was a kid, I remember neighbors and friends who had got sent up to, the name of the school was Ethan Allen, but it was in a city called Wales. And I knew when I was a kid that that's where all the so-called bad kids went. And it was used as a threat in our community. If you keep acting the way you're going to be acting, you're going to end up in Wales. Well, that really wasn't going to happen because in order to get to Wales, you had to do something pretty bad. So I was very nervous. And to make it even more sort of nerve-wracking was I wasn't really working in a classroom like this. I was working in a kitchen. So we were surrounded by knives and, you know, all the kinds of utensils that you would use if you were in a kitchen. So I was a chef. I put myself through school that way, so I knew my way around the kitchen. And my concern was, here I am working with juvenile delinquents, and we're working with 8, 12-inch French knives, you know, 6-inch boning knives, and those kinds of things. We had to be responsible for supervising them. So that made me even more nervous, because not only didn't I really understand where they were coming from culturally, but now we were working with knives. So my first day was extremely nervous. And what was that other question?
What was it like to teach in the JDC?
Teaching there it was a great experience for me. It was my first teaching experience, and I felt like my students taught me more than I could ever teach them. They taught me how to get along with students from different backgrounds. They taught me how to become a good teacher. They were kind of like my practice group. By listening to them and learning what they taught me, I think I became a much better teacher. I really enjoyed it. After getting over the first couple of days and being really nervous, that went away rather quickly. And to be honest with you, teaching at Ethan Allen was safer than teaching in the public schools, because we really didn't have to worry about weapons. We didn't have to worry about guns and knives. We didn't have to worry too much about drugs coming in. Periodically, there were incidents where we found weapons, where we found drugs, but it was much easier to get drugs and weapons in the public school than it was to get them into a secure prison. So I felt, after the first few, weeks, I felt really safe there. Even in terms of working with knives, because the students could see how skilled I was at using knives because I used it in a profession. And they began to respect me, so I could teach them things that they couldn't do. And the nice thing about when I was teaching cooking is you get to find out how good you did immediately, because you get to eat what you made. And the students really liked that. They got immediate feedback. So when they made something that was really good, it gave them a sense of pride, and they felt really good about what they were doing. So really, if it wouldn't have been for my supervisor, I'd probably still be there. I enjoyed teaching there very much. Did that kind of get at your question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Question 2. Steve, our main character, is a very sensitive person. He is very fearful of being in his JDC environment. Because he's scared, he's not sure how to act. Are you ever scared about the juvenile delinquents? If so, do they know you were scared and want to pick on you?
There were a couple of times where I was scared. I've had desks thrown at me. I've been threatened. I was never physically attacked, but I was threatened on a number of times. I tried not to show fear, and I tried to stay very calm. The last thing I wanted to do if somebody was up in my face and threatening me was to shout back or to be aggressive. I'm not a real big guy, so I'm not gonna be able to handle anyone physically anyway. So my approach was always to speak calmly, to let them get it out and try to relax. Now, when somebody throws a chair at you, obviously you're not going to sit there and just be calm. I mean, the thing to do is to move, because you don't want to get hit by a desk. So when that happened, and it was rare, and if it did happen, it was usually because I made a mistake. I tried my best to stay calm and present that front. Now inside, of course, my heart was going 100 miles an hour, but I tried to stay calm, relaxed, and the other thing that I could do is, if I wanted to, I could get a student locked up for 9 hours a day, and if things got really bad, I could send them to security. And the worst possible conditions that you could face in security when I was teaching was you could be locked up in your room for 23 hours a day, and you could be put in 4-point restraints. Now, 4-point restraints are wrist shackles connected to a long chain connected to leg shackles. That was the worst thing that could happen to a student if they got placed in security. I had that power if I wanted to use it. I really didn't use it all that much. For me, it was about trying to establish relationships with them and letting them know that I wasn't afraid of them, that I was there to try to do the best I could for them. But there were a lot of kids who were afraid. And I mean, let's face it, it was a dangerous place to be.
Well, that leads into question 3. Like, our main character, he's on trial for being a lookout in a crime scene. This seems like a small crime in comparison to other crimes that juveniles typically commit. Have you ever been threatened by a juvenile? If so, how did you react to that? Did you give him a certain punishment? Were you worried at all?
Yeah, I guess I kind of answered that. Yeah, I mean, I can think of some specific times where I was threatened. But the funny thing is, the only time I've ever been attacked was in public school. That's really the only time I've ever been attacked. And in public school, you don't have the same kinds of punishments. I mean, think about being in juvenile detention. You're locked up. There's only so many places that you can go. And I always felt like one of the worst things I could do to a kid is to give them hours. That's what we called it. You got 3 for disrespect. That means that at the end of the school day, you're going to be sitting in your room for 3 hours. Now, that might not seem like much, but let's say that the rooms are about, you see where the doorway is. Let's take that doorway to the end of that desk and then cut it over to the wall. That's the kind of space that you were looking at. And there were no windows, and it was brick walls, and all that was in there was a cot. So for me to say you got 3 for disrespect meant that that student was going to spend at least 3 hours that night locked up in his room doing nothing. And I thought that was a pretty serious punishment to give. But really, that's all we could do in terms of punishing students, is we had these referral slips and we'd write them out and we'd explain what happened. And then we'd put down the number of hours that we thought the students should serve. And then a supervisor would look at it, and then they'd either okay it, or they'd reduce the hours, or they'd increase the hours. But to send somebody to their room for that amount of time was pretty serious. So I tried not to use punishments much. And you know, the funny thing is, in public school, you can't do anything like that. There's really not a lot. I didn't feel like there was hardly anything I could do in public school to a student. Where when I was in the prison, I felt like I had a lot more power. But I didn't want to use it because I felt it was better to kind of sit down and figure out what our issues were and solve those problems than to just lock them up. I mean, you know, think about how would you feel if somebody locked you up for 3 hours? Personally, I'd be mad at them, and that's going to hurt the relationship I'm going to have with that person. You good?
Question 4: How long did you teach at the Juvenile Detention Center? What were some of your favorite moments?
I taught for 4 years there, and that's 4 years straight, because there's no summer vacation. You know, you get assigned to juvenile lockup, and you're there for the length of your sentence. You don't get out in the summer. So we worked 52 weeks a year. We got 2 weeks of vacation, but that was about it. Some of my favorite moments were there. There was one student in particular. His name was Anthony. When Anthony came to my room, he was 13. He was about maybe 5'1", 120 pounds, and just full of anger and fire. He was one of the first students to really, back then we called it going off. He was one of the first students to really go off on me. The first time we met, I just told him, I said, you know, I need you to sit down. And he called me, you can imagine the kind of language he used. I mean, he was dropping F-bombs left and right. He was up in my face, he was threatening me. And here he is, you know, he comes up to about maybe here on me, and he looks like he's made out of pipe cleaners. And I made the mistake of laughing, you know? Because, I mean, it was kind of funny because I'm not a big guy, but he was a lot smaller than I was, and he's just going off on me, and I started to laugh, and that made him absolutely crazy. So then I had to push the button, security came and hauled him out. I didn't see him again for 3 months. He ended up going to security for 3 months, okay? First time he came out, he lasted about 2 weeks. He was back in security. He was in and out like that for probably his first year here. And one day, I made a bet with him. I told him, I said, Anthony, you know, all you do is come in here and talk and talk and talk. That's all you do. I don't think it's possible for you to be quiet for 1 day. And he said, look, if I'm quiet for 1 week, will you give me a 12-pack of Mountain Dew? And I said, yeah, sure. After 3 days, he had made it, and I told him, I said, look, Anthony, you proved your point. He looked at me, he smiled, and he went like this. He did it. He did it for 5 full days. I got him the Mountain Dew, and our relationship became like this. He was one of my favorite people that I ever got to know. By the time Anthony left, he was 17, he was 6'3", he was about 180 pounds, and he was put together like an NFL defensive back. And he had grown so much. That was probably not necessarily a moment, but one of my favorite processes was to see him grow up, and mature. And, you know, the sad thing is, I never really knew what happened to them. But the relationship that we developed really taught me a lot about how to reach students with who are coming from some pretty serious, you know, conditions. So that's one of my favorite moments. I had quite a few, you know. There's a kid named Lloyd who was even smaller than Anthony, and he never got big, and I had all kinds of moments with him. I coached track there, and to see some of the, we had a high jumper win state one year. He jumped 6'11". That was a big deal. We had one of our athletes get a scholarship offer that turned his life around. So there were moments like that where, you know, you saw that you could say that maybe you had something to do with helping them get their lives turned around. So those are really positive moments.
I guess that leads into question 5, which is, what was the most interesting thing that ever happened while you were teaching?
Oh man, there's a lot of, every day was interesting because you never knew for sure what was going to happen. There was no routine, you know. Well, that's a hard question to answer in terms of the most interesting thing. One of the things that I learned was, you know, there was a lot of gang violence at that time. And I was working there just before crack cocaine hit the streets. We were just starting to get kids into the facility whose parents, whose moms had used crack. So they were coming in with all kinds of issues. But I think one of the most interesting things I learned was that we always have this perception of gangs as being terrible, and they do a lot of terrible things. But one thing that really stuck out to me was that gangs were also families. They were very protective of each other. And for some kids who have no other options, who lost their parents or something like that, everybody has to have something or someone to belong to in order to feel whole. And as bad as the gangs were, that's one of the more interesting things that I learned, was that there were times where I think gangs actually did some good for kids. And I never would have expected that, ever. But that's one thing that I'm kind of convinced about. You have a question?
No, not. Well, yeah, kind of. Well, like, while you were teaching there, did you, like, what was, like, it's hard to say it, so I just continue, it's kind of hard to say it.
Yeah, okay. Well, if you can figure it out, just let me know.
What is your biggest challenge when working with the juveniles?
My biggest challenge was helping students get to a point where they were feeling pretty good about themselves, that they were being successful within the institution. They were getting their schoolwork up, they had improved their reading levels. They were becoming more respectful of adults. And then they would be released. And they'd get sent back to the very same places that they came from. And then 2 weeks, 2 months, 4 months later, they'd get locked up again. And when they came back, they were way worse than when they first came in. So that was probably the most frustrating thing for me, was that we put a lot of work into helping them turn their lives around, and when they get released, they go right back to the same environment, and they go, you know, they come back worse. Even more frustrating was when it looked like some of the kids were going to turn the corner, you'd read about them in the paper. They'd find them dead in the Milwaukee River. They'd find them, they'd be in the headlines where they committed, you know, armed robbery and somebody got killed. So now they were done now, because now they were going up to adult. They were getting waived into adult court. So that was the most frustrating and disheartening thing for me, was to see somebody who looked like they were going to make it, and they'd either come back worse or we'd read about them in the paper. I mean, that would literally, it would just tear your heart right out, you know what I'm saying?
What is the strangest experience you have had teaching at the JDC?
Strangest. Probably the strangest it didn't come from the kids, it came from the people I was working with the other teachers. I was there for about 3 weeks, and there was a group of teachers who started a pool on me. You know what a pool is? A pool is, you know, like,
Are you gonna last?
what's that?
How long are you
How
gonna
long
last?
I was gonna last, exactly. They put together a chart, and they had laid out days and weeks, and they were actually betting on how long I would last. And it's funny, because some of the people who put that together, they left before I did. So that was probably one of the strangest things that I came across, because, you know, I kind of thought that when I got there, there'd be people there to support me, and there were some who definitely helped me out. But I think because it was a state operation, and they see a lot of turnover, because the guy whose position I filled, he only lasted 3 months. Within 13 months, I was the lead seniority person in my department. So there was a lot of turnaround. But for them to actually bet on when I would leave, I thought that was pretty interesting to me, and surprising. I never expected that.
Well, I think you already answered this, but who was your favorite student you have taught in the juvenile detention center?
Well, Anthony was certainly one of them, and I kind of told you about him. There was another, his name was Amos, and he was just a great kid. Talented basketball player, and I like college basketball. He probably couldn't read at a second grade level. And one of the things that I did to try to get the students interested in reading was to find out the kinds of things that they were interested in. And because Amos was interested in basketball, I got a weekly basketball journal that talked about the high school recruits, what was going on in the college scene at the different conference levels. Nothing about pros, just high school and college. And I got those delivered. And he started getting into it and, you know, asking me to help him read it. So him and Alfie too. Alfie was another one. Him and Amos they were backcourt mates actually. And I got to see them play a couple of times, and they were good. They could have probably played D2, D3 college. And bringing in those journals really helped them see a need to read, because they wanted to read about that. This was back in the day when Kenny Smith was playing and Charles Barkley, the guys that you see on TV now who are commentators. This was when they were playing college ball. So for them to get excited and find out what they were doing, got them excited about reading. Tony was not Anthony, this was a different one. This was Tony. Tony was one of my favorite because he taught me all about shoes and how important it was to dress and look good for those students, and he taught me a lot about gangs. So there were a lot of them that were really my favorites because they taught me about their lives, and they showed me how I could teach them. So those were some of my favorites, and I've had, you know, a few more. A kid whose nickname was Dynamite. He was a great kid. Unfortunately, he was one of those kids that we read about, you know. So it was there were a lot of favorites. The kids were easy to work with. It was the adults that was hard.
How often do some of the students get in trouble?
A lot depended on, really a lot depended on where they were and how early they were into the institution. So let's say that, you know, if you got a 12-year-old coming in, and we had kids as young as 9 there at one point, which I don't really agree with, but when you look at the crimes that they did, they had to have someplace safe for them. When they came in early, 12, 13 years old, they were usually pretty scared, so they didn't get into much trouble, unless they were wannabe gang members. The wannabe gang members were the most dangerous because they wanted to do something to impress the people who were higher up in the gang. So they would do really crazy stuff, like threaten teachers, maybe even smack a teacher, or go after one of the security guards. So whenever they did something like that, they were going to do a long stretch in solitary, in what they call it the hole, and then by doing that, they would get their props, they would get respect, and when they got out, they were looked at totally differently. Once they got their respect, they didn't have to act out. So the students who got in trouble the most were the ones who were looking for respect. Now, that wasn't always true. Sometimes the gang leaders would start stuff up with rival gangs, and then things would get really tense. And when that happened, there'd be a lockdown of the whole facility. They'd call in more security people, and they'd come in and they'd start checking cells. And when they started checking, that's when they'd find maybe makeshift knives. Usually what they found was drugs. And it was usually, like prescription drugs in powdered form. Not a lot of weed because that would smell. They would take things that were harder to trace. In my classroom, I think I had maybe 3 fights, and I think I probably had to call security maybe 5 times in 4 years. So there wasn't a lot going on. Gym was a place where students would get into it, competition over basketball, weightlifting, that kind of stuff. So people would start talking smack, and then that would escalate. So those were some of the problems that took place. But for the most part, you had maybe a core group of students. We had 340, 350 kids there. You had a core of probably 35, 40 who spent a lot of time in security. And more often than not, those were kids who were going to end up getting waived to adult somewhere down the road.
How many students were in your classes?
My classes? The most I had at one time was 13, and that was about 5 too many, because I was dealing with some pretty hardcore kids. My classes were typically running around 6 to 8, 6 to 10. 13 was a lot. And we were in we weren't in a school building, we were in the portable trailers, which meant we were working with some of the most difficult students, but the security guards were furthest away from us, which didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but that's kind of the way it was set up. So our classroom was about, I'd say, about where we are, cut this in half and go that way. And that would be the size of our classroom. And if you put 13 people in a space like that, it gets pretty tight, especially in the middle of June when the air conditioning isn't working. It gets really tight.
Do you guys have one kind of last question that you'd like to ask him?
Yeah, I thought of this, but what was the most biggest crime a person did you get into there, the worst?
Well, we had murderers. Yeah. I worked in a sexual assault unit, so we had kids who had been involved in sexual assault. We had some high-profile murders, armed robbery. Most of the students were in there for car theft, and later on, we were getting more students coming in for drug offenses. So it wasn't typical to have.
I'm sorry, did you say drug offenses?
Yeah. Crack cocaine was just starting to come in when I was on my way out. So that was it. But auto theft was big. because students could steal a car, drive it down to Milwaukee, sell it for $500, take the bus back to Milwaukee for $50. They made $450. If they stole 2 cars a month, they could feed their whole family. And that was their thought process. Why are you telling me that I should work at McDonald's for $3.25 an hour when all I have to do is boost 2 cars and I can feed my family for a month? It's kind of hard to argue with them.
Can I ask, you said that you didn't agree with the younger kids being put in, where were you? A correctional?
I was at it was a juvenile prison called Ethan Allen in Wisconsin.
Oh, okay. But what crimes would they commit? Like, what are some examples of crimes that 9-year-olds would
Well, we had a 9-year-old who was up for homicide. So there was really no place else to put them. But to have 9-year-olds, they had a separate cottage for them. And the cottages were the places where the students went to sleep. They weren't like, we're not talking log cabin, let's go fishing cottage. We're talking about secure lockdown with, the small rooms that I told you about. So those kids were together. So you had 9 to probably 12-year-olds together. But, like I said earlier, the thing is that some of those kids are coming in and their moms had used crack. So they were extremely violent and aggressive. And there was really, foster homes couldn't handle them. So they ended up sending them up by us. And the ages were getting younger. You had a question?
You already answered it.
Okay.
Well, I think that pretty much wraps it up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you.
you for coming.
Yeah.
And answering my questions.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks for having me. I hope it helps you with your book. It's a great book, by the way.